Dan, why can't I have a house?
Cheers before.
Well, yes.
Before you.
Yes.
Okay.
Cheers. Yes, bosses away, so we can have beers, and also we can have this promo, which is Sargon. Sargon has gone on holiday, and so we are offering 50% off every tier that you sign up for the next 3 months. So come and join us before the boss comes back and realizes what we've done. But you'll be in by then, so it'll be fine. Right? Yes. So economics. So should I? Well, I've got a series here. It's called Brokenomics, where we sort of talk about economic stuff. I thought that it might be good to give a very quick summary of everything that's gone wrong. Like if I
we'll be here all week.
Well, no, I'll try and keep it quick. The first thing, because sometimes I started off with the boomers are to blame, but the boomers get upset when I say that. So the people who are to blame are the greatest generation, the people who won the war, right? You see, because what happened is because they went off and won a war, and when you have a bit of a fight, what you want to do, it kind of gets it gets the ardor up, doesn't it? It gets you a bit frisky. And obviously all the greatest generation ladies, they were seeing all like Soldier Boy coming back. So anyway, they had lots and lots of babies. That's the central problem. They had the boomers, and then there was lots and lots of boomers. There was something else that happened after the war as well, which got to do with gold. I'll come back to that. But anyway, you get this massive generation spike. Now, you might think, okay, that being a member of a small generation is better than being part of a large generation, less competition for jobs, all that kind of stuff. Funnily enough, it's not. It doesn't actually work that way. It's if you're part of a large generation, you kind of mold the society to you a bit like a snake eating a gazelle or something as you sort of pass through the machine, right? So that started to happen. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention about the gold, about the war, is that during the war, everybody sent their gold to America. Yeah, for safekeeping. Well, and also because they were the only productive economy left, and they were making stuff, so they were getting lots and lots of gold. Anyway,
we also owed them loads and loads of money.
Well, yes, there is that as well. So basically, the Americans had all of the gold at the end of the war, and they had to think about it and decided that they wanted to keep it. They thought it'd be better for everybody concerned if they hung on to the gold. So they came up with a clever idea, which was they were gonna have a new system where the dollar is basically the same thing as gold. So you can just use the dollar, which is fine, and then we keep the gold, and everybody's happy. Seems reasonable, right? The only slight problem with that is that the Americans, and in fact everybody, they then started spending a lot because they figured out that the way to win an election in a democracy is basically just promise people loads of stuff and then worry about how you're going to pay for it
in exchange for votes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So we got these two big setup problems. One, Western countries are now spending too much, and we've got all these baby boomers. I mean, they're still just kids at this point. Well, actually, no. Actually, the bit where it gets exciting is the 70s. The 70s is where this really all kicks off because you had the 50s and 60s, which was like a sort of Western golden age. We'd won a war. We've got a new system in place. Everybody's happy. We're all on board with the new mission. The American dream is born. The UK was in a bit of decline, but the West as a whole under American stewardship, that was all going well. Right, 70s arrive. Starts to go wrong here. So first thing is the government had basically spent all of their money, and they started to realize that this system where the Americans get to keep all the gold, that's not going to work anymore because the Americans are spending it all. So the French said, right, we want our gold back. And the Americans were like, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. So what they said is, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to break the link between the dollar and gold. And the dollar is now, and this is the slightly ridiculous bit, but I do cover it in some detail. The dollar is now backed by debt. It literally became a debt-based currency where they sort of created, the more debt you create, the more money you create, and therefore it creates this incentive to always create more debt because you can't pay off the amount of debt that you've got with the current amount of resources, so you need to constantly expand. And you've got this constantly creating money flow. Now, why did we get away with that for so many decades? Well, the answer is because the boomers. So we got lots of new people. So this massive spike of people that were created after the war, the baby boomers, they start arriving into the workforce in the 70s. So they start going out and they start buying, a new suit and a new house and a new car, getting their first job, going out buying furniture. I mean, chip in with questions whenever you like, guys. I'll just monologue through this. But they start expanding this economy and then taking on debt. But that thing I mentioned earlier about how we've disconnected money from
Gold.
currency, so the dollar from gold. What happened in that 1970s point is previous to that, people are becoming more productive, so the economy increased, and you basically had a straight line connection between productivity increases and wages. I mean, the two things were connected because as productivity increased, wages increased. Now, what happened in 1971 is those two lines broke apart. So you now had productivity continuing to rise at the same rate that it always had, but wages basically flatlined. So you've got this big population. They're creating lots of debt through the virtue of going off and buying things and contributing to the economy in all of this way. But their wages in real terms were actually going flat this whole entire time. But we were now in an expansionary economy. Right, so what are you going to do about it? Well, what you do is you basically just borrow the difference. So what you then started to have is a whole culture of people who, because their wages were flatlining, decided that they were just going to start borrowing in order to make up the difference, in order to get that sort of growth. And it worked because assets sort of increased by an outsized amount of return compared to this debt they were taking on. So basically, if you're a boomer and you bought a house, you're fine. You're even better if you're a boomer and you bought a house and borrowed money and put it in the stock market. That definitely worked. But at least if you bought a house, it worked because your house price would increase and therefore the value of your assets would increase as well. Right.
And also, even if you made relatively poor choices years ago when they've created these social safety net systems of socialized healthcare and the pension system, then the boomer mindset is, well, I've paid into this all my life, therefore I can take out exactly as much as I want, as I'm entitled to when I get to the ripe old age of my mid-60s.
Yes.
Unfortunately, obviously, with the dislocation of the money supply with anything of actual worth, what ends up happening is they just keep printing money to buy up more of that debt and expanding the economy. And then what ends up happening is inflation, because the pensions in this country particularly are tied to the rate of inflation. It actually gets outpaced of like how much it's worth. So you never, if you're a boomer, you never actually paid enough into the system to extract the same amount you would get outwards. So it's just the current people's taxes are paying for the entitlements you've got. So you're just robbing from the current generation.
Yes. So that was, so we're out of the 70s now. We're now in the 80s, and exactly that dynamic is happening. So what was happening in the 80s is basically the boomers started to run everything because they're a big generation, and so their people go in and they start doing stuff. Right. And they basically decide every election from that point on. Now, it started off as being a generous thing because, I mean, they're looking at their parents' generation, the guys who fought in the war, bunch of heroes, all of them, bless them. And back then, basically, the poor people were synonymous with old people. Like, it's basically the same thing. There were rich old people, but there weren't many. It was basically old people are poor people. So the boomers, they said, well, okay, well, let's be nice and start putting these social insurance programs in place. So it was, more generous pensions. It was more expansive NHS. It was welfare systems, all of this kind of stuff. And all of it was eminently affordable because you had this massive working age population, the boomers, literally a boom in the population, supporting a relatively small number of old people, all of whom were poor, and they'd fought in the war, so they bloody deserved it. So they're getting something. They were supporting a relatively small number of people who couldn't be bothered to work or whatever else it was, or disabled, or all of those things, because the culture was different back then, and there wasn't just a huge number of those people. And the NHS, of course, again, not really an issue because there's such a large amount of people in the productive sphere that the small number of people who are old and are falling apart and need lots of NHS and all the rest of it and have nasty accidents,
well, also
number.
You had lower immigration, so there were fewer people that were never paying into the system, using the system, and generally speaking, you didn't have so much abundance and so many things like microplastics and genetically modified food and like, so people weren't getting sick as much, they weren't as fat, they weren't having as many adverse lifestyle choices that would mean extra costs for the people that were healthy and were productive and paying into the system. So 80s and 90s, another really good time. Lots of expansion, lots of boom. This whole kind of thing works. And during the reigns of the 80s, with Thatcher and Reagan, the working age population was increasing from the native stock by about 2% a year.
And if you think of an economy basically just being, well, the economy is obviously GDP per capita times capita. So the capita was increasing. You get that 2% growth throughout the 80s. So you're getting that lovely expansion all of the time. So this money system that you talked about before that requires that permanent growth, I mean, it works, because even though the money supply is expanding, the underlying resources are already expanding along with it, and the population's growing. So that gets us through the 80s, that large population, working age population expansion. Right, then comes the 90s and the early 2000s. And what happens then? Actually, I should also mention the women, because they started to join the workforce more, so that expanded. It was previously I hadn't been doing that. Right, 90s and 2000s. Then you get these sort of world trade deals, the time of globalism, and we now started getting the Chinese and the Indians and all those sort of people coming into the workforce. So again, the underlying productive capacity of the economy is expanding all of the time, because we've got this expanding money system. So it looks like it's working on a superficial basis. Real wages aren't going up, but if you own a house, and everybody does at this point, that ticks up every year, and so you feel richer anyway, and then you can borrow against it, and everything works. Then you get to the 2010s, and all hell starts to break loose, because now, well, 2008 basically it all started to break, because you haven't got this expansion anymore, because the working age population is not growing, because the boomers are now leaving the workforce. They're no longer joining it. They had a reasonably large generation behind them, which are the millennials, but nowhere near as large as in relative terms as they were. There's no more China to add. There's no more India to add. I mean, I suppose you could add Africa, but that didn't work.
Well, they haven't reached the development level required yet. And then the Chinese are spending all the money on that and ring fencing them away from.
Well, the Chinese are doing the
economy.
Well.
Yeah, well, yeah, but also if the Chinese are capturing all the resources in Africa and also strip mining it and putting their people in place rather than the Africans building it up, that means that the Chinese have monopoly on that section of the market, and they actually hate us. So that's not wise to do either.
So you've now got a situation where you've got this very large population which is trying to draw on this stock of benefits that was actually designed for a large generation supporting a small generation. And this is why the bloody wheels are coming off. And when you look at it in this sense, you can start to understand what's really happening in the world today. So, for example, take Georgia Maloney, for example.
I wanted to ask in her 20s. I wanted to ask you about Italy specifically.
Well, so this is a classic example. So she wins power by saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to stop the immigration. We're going to make Italy for the Italians." But I think almost certainly what happened is she got into office, and then the accountants came over and they showed her the numbers, and they said, "Well, look, you've got a lot of old Italians. You've got a lot of debt, and if you want any possibility of the old Italians getting their pension, then you need to increase the economy." And what did we talk about before? The economy is GDP per capita times capita. So look, this is the GDP per capita that we're getting from the Italians. It's this number. Well, why don't we just go and get a whole bunch of Africans? And this is the modern theory, which is all capita equal. So we just go off and we get a whole bunch of Africans and we bring them in, and that will increase the capita times the GDP per capita, and the economy is bigger. Now you can pay your pensions.
Well, the important thing that means that politicians are persuaded by this is just looking at the raw birth metrics. And of course, this is a symbiotic thing, because these are driven down by adverse economic conditions. I've spoken to Stephen Shaw about this, and he said ever since 1973, where the oil shock hit and Italy experienced a hell of a lot of economic downturn, their birth rate has been collapsing at such a precipitous rate that they're one of the lowest in the world now, and they're sitting at about 1. And bear in mind, for people that don't realize, demographic replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman. So they are facing total collapse. And so they're thinking, why don't we just battery farm a bunch of Eritreans and then line go up?
Yeah, and of course it won't work, because if you are raised in a Western economy, your ability to add to that economy is significantly higher than somebody who arrived on a boat 5 minutes ago and doesn't know anything about the culture and whatever else characteristics they might have to their contribution.
Yeah, this is
a lack of
a sort of faulty liberal universalist presupposition that all people are fundamentally equal despite birth station and culture and the like. And running an economy on that presumption, we're seeing the decline right now.
Yeah, but genuinely, the country's economists, there are different kinds of economists. There are economists like me who don't get jobs working for government, and then there are economists who do get jobs working for government, and they work on that set of presuppositions.
I wanted to ask you about that in specific. Yeah, because I remember from my days back when I was studying economics. So one question. Does Italy have a massive debt?
Oh, yeah, loads.
Okay. And it's not the only country. Now, I remember in the university, we were told that you never repay your debt. You're just paying the dose every now and then.
Yeah, when you get to 50, it will be written off anyway, and it just suddenly disappears into the ether, not like a taxpayer's been guaranteeing.
Exactly, and this doesn't cause only an economic problem to a country. It also poses a political problem, because at some point, if you are basically creating an unsustainable system, at some point it's going to hit the fan. And then you are not going to.
So let's address that point, because that's the one that they always. That's the thing that those type of economists, the mainstream people, and the journalists, they always come back to. They say, "Oh, don't worry, it doesn't work like a household. You just increase the debt forever." Now, in answer to your earlier question, does Italy have a lot of debt? Italy's debt to GDP ratio is 170%, which is proper bad. I mean, in the UK and US, it's 100% debt to GDP. Now, let's talk
Greece level.
Yeah. Well, basically, after 70%, you're screwed. I explain why no economics, but let's go with the UK US example of why 100% of debt to GDP matters to the point that you raised. Okay, because if they're the same size, it makes the maths really simple. Which one is growing more? So is your economy growing more? Is the debt growing more? Well, we know how much the debt is growing because it's the coupon on the debt. So it's basically the interest rate. So the interest rate at the moment, what are you up to? Like now, 4-5%, something like that. Is the economy growing at 4-5%? No, not even close. It's growing at 1 point something, and in fact the growth is getting strangled because the taxes to service the debt and the government spending are now strangling the productive output of the economy. So of course the growth is going to go low, and of course we're going to have a productivity crisis, and of course that can't grow. So and the other so the rate we're paying on our debt. Okay, and this comes on to let me do a slightly more complicated thought on this now. Okay, so the rate that we're paying on the debt is a function of when we lent the money out. So we're lending out tranches of bonds all the time. Now, a lot of it was issued when that debt was at a really low level, so the base rate of almost zero. So the rate that we're paying on that government debt for the UK and US is close to 0 or 1% or something like that. What's happening is every year that we are now on these higher interest rates, they are having to generate more debt to replace the old debt, and is swapping out 0% rates for 5% rates. Now, what does that do to our national finances when you've got debt at this sort of level? Basically, it's going to increasingly squeeze out everything. So I'll throw in a practical point here. I think almost certainly that what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to find an excuse to dramatically lower those interest rates very soon, so that they can roll over all of the government debt at a rate that they can actually afford, because it's either that or say, okay, well, we're just shutting down Medicare, Medicaid, the NHS, the military, welfare payment. A whole bunch of those stuff would have to go. I think the US are now paying something like $1 trillion. Well, they're on track to pay $1 trillion a year just in interest costs, and they only collect something like 4.6 trillion.
Yeah.
So this whole thing. So to your point about when you're told, and everybody's told this in the media, that don't worry about the debt because you never pay it off. Well, yeah, but you have to service the debt, and when both the economy and the debt is at 100%, all of your GDP growth is being consumed by the debt payments.
Yeah. Because
GDP growth, what is it? It's basically it's population growth, like we talked about. It's the productivity increase, which, as we talked about, is being completely strangled out, and it's debt growth as well. And they're trying to jerry-rig that by taking a fourth factor, which is immigration, to sub out that first one, which is the population growth. So they're desperately trying to say, okay, well, we know we're not getting any productivity growth because we're taxing the shit out of everybody. So of course they're not going to have any productivity growth. In fact,
well, growth hasn't grown since around the 1990s as well. This was something that an economist over at the Telegraph observed when he was looking at the birth rates versus immigration argument, and he was making the case that, okay, even if you've been importing all these people since 1997 when something happened, the people are not nearly as productive as the native population because they don't benefit from the same education system and the value system. So by substituting them out, you might be able to count GDP because you're spending more money and government spending is factored into GDP, and more people exchanging more money in more hands equals more line. But that doesn't mean that the rate of change is as it would be were the native population having babies, just because they're not as productive.
Yes, and I mean the rate of change of technology is continuing to go up at a fairly consistent rate. So the technology is improved, but then you've got another issue there, which is All of this technology requires capital funding in order to get up to scale on anything, in order to create, the next big software thing that can move the boxes and so on. And the capital costs are basically lower in the US because they're the fountain of this, of creating effectively creating the money supply, which every other system runs off. So we're kind of screwed on a whole number of ways. This debt is really getting ahead of us, and actually, I'm going to do a bit of a crossover now with Bo's series, because I did one on the tulip bubble with Bo, but we also covered things like the South Sea bubble and that kind of stuff. And basically, what happens throughout history is this situation that I'm talking about now is happened a whole bunch of different times. Where basically the government gets far too far ahead of itself, gets far too much in debt. And basically the same solution plays out every single time, which is the government finds a way of shifting it onto the people and then wiping it out. Because they don't want to take the knock. And that's almost certainly what's going to happen again now. And I think what it's probably going to happen is we're probably going to go into something called financial repression, where we say, okay, everybody who's got a pension or something else that the government can get its claws into, we're going to say, okay, you're going to have to own this safe government debt, because we don't want you taking risks on crypto or shares or tech or whatever it is. So we're going to make you buy safe government bonds, and once they've shoved enough of it out, then you can restructure it and you can wipe it out. And the interesting thing is, okay, how are they going to restructure it? Are they just going to do it honestly and say, all these bonds that we put out, we're only paying 50 pence on the pound for everything that we put out? Or are they just going to keep inflating the money supply?
Yeah. Question here, because it has to do with how the meaning of concepts change. Now, I think that the notion of inflation is a notion that has changed its conventional meaning.
Yes, very much so.
And you're talking about it quite a lot. In fact, your second, Brokenomics, is about inflation.
Yes.
It's called Inflation, the Greatest Lie. How has this, what is the significance of this?
Well, if you've got a dictionary, and this is an interesting challenge for anybody at home, if you've got a dictionary at home which was written in probably the 80s, it started to change in the 90s, and you look up the word inflation, what you'll see is it will say an increase in the money supply, because that's actually what it is. It's the total amount of money increasing. Whereas if you look in a dictionary that was written from sort of late 90s onwards, it says inflation is the price of goods going up. No, that's a symptom of what inflation actually, which is increasing the money supply. So that's what you got into at the moment. So every time the government's run out of money, they do the massive refinancing. They do the quantitative easing, which we had back in 2008, where they created a whole bunch more money. That created inflation. We then had that again in 2020. A whole bunch of more money was created. And then following from that, 18 months later, there was a whole bunch of inflation. And now they're trying to gaslit us to say, and the Bank of England is doing this, is saying, don't you dare ask for pay increases, because that will cause inflation. No, the money you created is the inflation. Yes. They're just trying, what they're actually trying to do is to devalue the denominator, so devalue the debt, while making you accept lower wages, so that the whole capital structure can be preserved and you get poorer. It's basically trying to make workers be the bag carriers. And this stuff, I mean, if I could have a half-hour conversation with everybody in the country, there would be a revolution. There would be heads on spikes and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But because it's a bit convoluted, basically they kind of get away with it.
So
it's just theft at a huge scale.
You said before that as an economist, you wouldn't get a job in the government.
Yes.
Because I suspect that you are more of an Austrian.
There's various
Austrian
different types, but
it's more free market friendly, isn't it?
The main ones are the Austrians, who basically tend to look at these problems and conclude that the government needs to get smaller and we need money that you can't debase. Yes. So proper money like gold or potentially even Bitcoin in the future. And
do they also make controversial statements like you shouldn't consume more than you produce?
Yeah, well, we turn it the other way around. We say that because the Keynesians, the guys on the other side, they're always worrying about the demand problem. Is there enough demand for the goods and all that kind of stuff? Whereas we turn it around the other way and say demand is basically infinite. I mean, if I could have mansions and yachts, I would have it. What I have is a supply problem, which is being able to produce enough value in order to create the,
Is it also demand of jobs, so i.e. labor shortages?
Well, no, it's productivity. If everybody was churning out a massive amount of productive output all the time, then we would have that surplus that then allow us to redistribute it and spend it on leisure goods or whatever else that we wanted to spend it on.
The reason I'm asking is because I think that in, let's say, in the Austrian school, there's the idea that if something doesn't work, stop doing it. Whereas in the Keynesian school is if something goes wrong, just double down on it, and keep doing it again. And the reason I mentioned labor shortages and the emphasis on demand is to link it with the demographic problem you said before, especially when you mentioned Italy, that, for instance, people told to Meloni that, you want all these positions to be covered.
Yes.
And God forbid if some of these positions, that maybe some of them are not even required, they go on.
Yeah, I did a Brokenomics yesterday.
That's why I mentioned
I did a Brokenomics yesterday, which will be coming out in a week or two on house prices. I've got a couple of housing developers in here, and we talked about why house prices cost as much as they do. And it's kind of ridiculous because you would think that the house building process involves buying a bit of land, building a house on it, sticking a markup on it, and off you go. Bob's your uncle. It's not that at all. The amount of consultants...
There have to be middlemen in. That's the issue. Create a middleman.
But there are hundreds of middlemen in this process, hundreds of consultants and people who tick boxes and do that kind of. I mean, seriously, they want it whenever they want to build houses. They need a team of consultants to sit on the site overnight for a week with a pair of binoculars, counting the bats that fly overhead, and that's just one team of consultants that go into the process of building houses. And this is for brownfield sites as well as greenfield. So it's just. Our economy has become so, and what that is it's basically stealth taxation through different means. I mean, building it on into the supply chain. So we looked at communist China and say, okay, well they're communist because the Chinese own 26% of the economy. Well, I mean, in this country, it's like 52%. Once you add on all of the ways that the government controls, and then bear in mind if everything else. Because they're controlling the money rate, that's effectively communism, but just at the money tier.
Question. What do you think of the statement that inflation in the standard sense is an indirect tax?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because your purchasing power is being diluted and the value of that is transferred to effectively the debt holders, which is largely the government, which is, like I say, the debt's the same size as the economy. So yeah, that is, and absolutely. So if you've got, as we've had for the last couple of years, you've had debt of at least 10%. You've had a 10% pay cut before you've done anything else, which is effectively a taxation. So I'll cap this off. So Brokenomics, check that out. Use the code SARGON to get a discount on signing up. Where I cover lots of things. I'll whiz through this as fast as I can. So we cover all the basics like inflation, interest rates, debt, deficit, gold, Bitcoin, CBDCs, universal basic incomes. I do like to do a bit of stuff on the pandemic because it really annoyed me. So now I've got a platform. I do things on face masks and digital IDs and the economics of lockdown. Oh, and the Canadian trucker protest, that'll be coming out soon as well. And I do topics like BlackRock, Thomas Sowell. We did that one. That was a good one. Actually, one of the most popular ones was I analysed the film Margin Call, which was a bit random, but people love that one. Debt ceilings, what happened in 1971, fourth turning, the economics of the USSR. I mean, a whole bunch of different stuff.
We're going to have a very fun one.
Oh, yes, we're going to do Hoflation, aren't we? Yes.
Yeah, we are, yeah.
Yes.
You've decided to make me your guinea pig,
which
has been horrendous. Because everyone, all the Zoomers in the comments were going, well, Dan, AA, and Cole don't understand dating as a young man.
So we sent him out.
Yeah. Been a disaster.
Yes, and we're both reading up on the economics of
how the actual mechanics of apps and swipe culture and that and contain perverse incentives that never actually get you a girlfriend. So that'll be fun one.
Yes, we're diving into that. So we're tackling all the important issues. So yes, if you like the sound of that, I'd do a bit more structured on the actual Brokenomics. But that was off the top of the head what I'm talking about. So check that out.
A masterful riff.
Yes, thank you.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Brokenomics series, this one on the economics of empire with AA. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.